Thank you for coming today. We have a great positions taking part in the book launch, Political Choreographies, Decolonial Theories, Trans Bodies. And I would like immediately to welcome the speakers for this book launch, Asma Aiad, Jelena Petrović, Piro Rexhepi, Bogdan Popa, and Basha Changuera and Mika Maruyama will join us later. Also with at least some positions in the audience, because we are having this promotion, this launch of the book in Ljubljana, in the space of the Scientific and Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Science and Arts. And we are actually also having in front of us several books that we published and that are prior to this last book that will be the center of our talk today. So maybe if I just say who I am Marina Gržinić. I'm one of the editors of this book, and with me is
Jovita Pristovšek, also.
Yes.
Editor. Yes.
So maybe you can go on
Yes.
with, before we go to our speakers with the small history where we
Yes.
stand.
So the book we are about to launch today is actually third in a row with Cambridge Scholars Publishing, and we have some history with this publisher. It's not working. Okay, now it's working. So this is the first book. It was published in 2020. It arose from the art and theory-based research project Genealogy of Amnesia, which was awarded funding by the Austrian Science Fund from 2018 and 2020. Its title, as you can see, is Opposing Colonialism, Anti-Semitism and Turbo-Nationalism, Rethinking the Past for New Conviviality. So this volume actually gathered together reflections on racism, nationalism, empowerment and futurity, to focus on collective amnesia in regards to traumatic events of the European past and the ways in which memory and history are presented for the future.
Our second book that came 2 years later, in 2022, has a title, Reactivating Critical Thinking in the Midst of Necropolitical Realities for Radical Change. Why is this important that we have these two books prior to our new one? Because they are all connected and they are making a context. So this volume from 2022 was focused on the pluriversal generation. We wanted to work with a younger group of scholars and also to put together positions that are not usually working together. So a mixture of the world in some global geopolitical setting, but also our interest was how necropolitics and necropolitical regimes of governmentality arrange the space not only of the social and political but also of theory. And the questions that we posed was, is possible any radical change, or we are just looping and organizing our forces against, but everything stays the same. And the book proved actually to be a big potential for the future. Now we are...
And here we are with the third book and its inaugural launch. We actually plan to have a second presentation in fall. And maybe it will not be only on Zoom, but if not, we can do it also on Zoom. But before Marina tells you a bit more about what is the book about, we just want to say that this book is made in a manner of interviews, because we saw this format as a new new way of reaching wider audience, especially with the topics that are not so easy to grasp the large audience worldwide. So,
yeah. So why we decided to do this? We decided because when we talk about topics of repression, marginalization, disposed bodies, it's always a point that people say, but we cannot understand this academic discourse. So we decided to enter the idea to have interviews, and actually the whole book, all the 7 parts they will present very shortly, they are as interviews. So what is the book about? We go back to always, maybe obsessionally, one topic that stays from all the 3 books, and it's coming as essential from many different points of view. And this is, we question what are the changes that are along the colonial racial divide. So our question in this specific context with the title Political Choreographies is about moving. So it's, of course, choreography, it's not just social choreography, it's politics, it's about body, it's about the practice, but we are also very much into the question who can go where, who can move, who is actually stopped, who is immobilized, who is silenced, who actually cannot move. And then we also pose the question, what kind of body, movement, politics actually are or is allowed, what is not, what is actually put outside of our visibility, or it's there but is made invisible. And also how this movement is connected with a different system of bureaucracy and controls. So, of course, the discussions on bodies includes gender, decolonial horizons, and also questions of justice. Specifically, we went now for the question how justice can be defined, how actually justice can be regained, and also we work with theory in this book. Everybody is asked to reflect, and the theory is decolonial theory, black Marxism, it's of course Marxism from former Eastern Europe, it's trans studies, and it's questions shaped finally always the same but not the same with race, class, and trans. So this is some kind of overall, very short description what these books with interviews is bringing. But if we go through.
Yes. So as you see, the book consists of 7 parts, and each part is a conversation about a topical issue. Practically all the conversation except one were recorded via Zoom platform. So the last conversation with Ruan Grupa took place in public to question the dialectic of opening and closing, of immobility and the desire for separation, and in particular the very important exhibition of contemporary art, Documenta in Kassel in Germany.
Yeah, maybe I wanted also to say, before we go from the last part that will be the start of the presentation of the book, I said in the beginning that this book also has a small specific history, that we came to the point of choreographies was also connected with a group of scholars that I had a chance to meet and talk. They were all, at that point, were connected with Bloomsbury Publishing House. And when we met in some session, we started to talk about choreographies, about movement and so on, but unfortunately that whole story stopped. It was not going on. So this was also the elements of importance why to go and to continue with choreographies, but absolutely politically, not so much as dance, though in our book we have special chapters and special parts that also work with dance. So if we go from the start, and we go with the first presentation or the first part in the book, it opens with an interview with Nomusa Makhubu, and maybe you can give us a small...
Yes, actually we made a glossary as a first part, to be fair, and we made an alphabetical list of terms and ideas that emerge from all conversations with these radical, decolonial, black Marxist and contemporary dance positions. And we actually the idea was to take really important quotations that emerge from these conversations and to assemble it as a kind of extended index that can guide a reader through the topics discussed. So the second part,
when we come to Nomusa Makhubu, it's that we actually, before the final part, as it was said, is the interview with the group, Ruan Grupa, we decided to have like first and last move. What this means. We opened with a conversation with Nomusa Makhubu, that is an associate professor of art history and visual culture at the University of Cape Town. And when we start this discussion, we also understood that you cannot just talk about everything, that you have to frame ourselves, that we have to actually go to something that is central in that moment with each of the authors, and we will see very clearly today. Each has one topic or one book or one thing that is really key for the moment when we go into this interview. So with Nomusa Makhubu, we depart from a text or a book that she published in 2019 with Nukule Mabasu, and the title is and was "There Are Mechanisms in Place." And in that context, Nomusa Makhubu, that was super important for us, also as a way to think, to include the African continent, to make the exploration with Europe, she puts into play different figurations, as she calls this, racial, class, trans, queer figurations, and also very much confronts the colonial legacy. After this entrance of the first move, we call this other knowledge, we went also to the second move. We invited Mika Maruyama, and she will talk about her part, what she called an intra-Asian relations. We come then to the new part number 4, about Asian roots and Europe of ignorance, and it was a talk with Carla Max Aschenbrenner, choreographer but also producer that spent most of his life or their life now in Asia. In the first part number 5, we come to the interviews that we will talk today with the title Insurgent Flows, Trans-Decolonial and Black Marxist Futures. That is also the basis for a film that we will finish, and it's a longer experimental film. And then we come to the second move. The second move was the other knowledge again, but now like a finale, a conversation with Macarena Gomez Barish. And that was the idea that we finish the whole book with this interview, and that we come to the point also as Macarena Gomez Barish, it's very much into the possibility of going beyond necropolitics, going into potentialities, into searching the perspective of future. But then happened something different. We went with the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna to Documenta in Kassel. And this is when we start actually now our talk with our guests, and we go from the number 7 part of the book back to the start. So I would like to start this talk with Asma Aiad, and why? Because our second guest in that section is Jelena Petrović, but Asma was not only reflecting in situ, live as Jelena Petrović, the interview or the public talk we had with Ruan Group at the Academy of Fine Arts, but also Asma, you were with us there in Documenta Kassel. And this open question, because your comment, your intervention that is published in the book, extremely important, is precisely connected with this. So, Asma, welcome once again.
Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe
yes,
you
for
can
those of you,
yes.
yeah, for those of you who don't know Asma, we want to say 2 sentences about her and her work. She's a Viennese conceptual artist, activist, and youth worker, currently completing her master's in gender studies on the topic of Islamic feminism, and is studying at the Studio for Post-Conceptual Art Practices at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna. Also, she is a mastermind of Muslim Contemporary, really important festival, multidisciplinary festival, which will have its 3rd edition this year in November, as I've heard. So, Asma, you're very welcome.
Yeah. So, Asma, I would like if we can start this intervention with your opinion of that exhibition, because you were there, and we were all fascinated by the show of the Ruan Gruppa. And yeah, your first impression, what was and how you think that exhibition, that setting of the Documenta 15 mark the time that we are living?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me with you, and I'm really feeling very honored to share also this part I could contribute to this book. The Documenta was for me the first Documenta I visited. Either those, I felt that it was a totally different Documenta than any others, even though that I couldn't compare it with another Documenta, but the spirit of the artistic work which were presented there in Kassel were really talked about so important and so actual points which we have to deal with, not only in the art world, but also in general, very, very important political topics we have to deal with in Europe in general, or I would also say in the world. So therefore, it was for me very nice to be there, to see all of these different works from all over the world in the different places of the city, and to also watch and discuss also with my colleague different topics which this Documenta was talking about and dealing with. And we can see that this Documenta talked about so many topics, and this Documenta also was the reason for a lot of topics which were very actual after this Documenta. We had this big topic about anti-Semitism, the big critique about the Documenta, the big critique about who was chosen to create this Documenta. And I think all of this happened there, and all of this shown there was for me a big sign, a big question. That was also the question I asked at this meeting with Ruan Gruppa, because it was asked to Ruan Gruppa if they were ready for Europe and were ready to come to Europe and do all of this. But I think the big question which we have to ask ourselves in Europe is if we were ready for Ruan Gruppa.
Mm-hmm. So your intervention also showed actually that in a certain way Europe, in that Eurocentric perception and exclusion of other worlds, that seemed at first that is not the case, because just inviting them, in a certain feeling was that they were pushed and not really informed clearly what actually is to expect in Europe. And that attacks, also we will talk with Jelena Petrović, was in a certain way pushing and making invisible the whole documenta. Practically, it was no discussion about the works. And I remember also in your comment, but other discussion that are present in this interview in the last part of the book, was the question that it was no discussion about the documenta. It was not discussion what it brings. Many the things were just going on the line of this critique and accusation. So in a certain way, what will be also your opinion and what you said, because you are understanding wonderfully Arabic, and you said never ever so much text and so much discourses was there in Arabic that nobody practically questioned or put or discussed.
Yes, and even though also Marina, I think that even the topic, and for sure it was a big scandal about anti-Semitic works there, and I think, and after this there also happened a lot of racist attacks on different works, and I think even this wasn't possible to be dealt with, and even this wasn't possible to have a room to talk about the problem about anti-Semitism in Europe, the problem about racism in Europe, to talk about very contemporary topics through art. And I think even this wasn't possible. Perhaps is asked out and say, okay, how can deal with it? Because yes, we still have a problem of anti-Semitism in Europe. Yes, racism is still a topic in Europe, but see all this through this documenta, and see all of this, to give space to discuss and to talk about this wasn't possible at all. And I think that's the pity, and that's also a question, the question also, like how we deal with so many important topics in our society. And next to this, for sure, so many other topics this doctor brought in, like the process of art, where those art take place, how can we be the distributors, or how can we question all through art different topics which are very important in our society, who is part of art and who is not part of art. And you said this beautiful example of, for example, this Arabic, a lot of Arabic words included, and it was so interesting to go through all of this. And it was also for me as an artist who understands Arabic and English or German, it was also very interesting to go through all of this and see it from different perspectives. And for example, I can remember one specific artwork where the text in Arabic was saying totally different things than the translation of it in German. And also to see this, to understand how can you set this work in this context, and what does it do also to somebody who understands this language and can see it from a totally different perspective. So therefore, I had the feeling that this documenta opened up so many opportunities for us as a European clientele and to seeing this art, but also opened up so many perspectives for marginalized artists living in Europe to discuss art in a totally different way and to understand how art could look like. But there wasn't any chance to talk about all of this, and to also not to be misunderstood, to also take in very, very critical things what happened at this documenta, to say, yes, also those things are very important to talk about, and not only say, okay, we took something down, that's it. Because I think to take something down was an important step, but how to talk about all of this, what happens then, and not say, okay, I don't know, it's part of our European history is a problematic one, and we said we'll never do this again. But then there have to be work, because there have to be and more work who also deal with all of this topic and all of this our history. And therefore, that was the part I tried to ask Grupa also, if they would be given the chance to repeat this document again, if they would do it again, and if yes, why? If no, why? And if yes, what would they change? And the answer was very clear, because in their opinion, they wouldn't do this experience again. And this raised me the question, if this was in general a learning enough for us, or what would we change to also say that art can deal in art questions, also very contemporary questions in our society nowadays. And I think that that's not happening enough.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for this reflection, because this actually takes us directly to Jelena Petrović. So just to let you know, this interview that was actually like a public interview in which Asma and many who were there, it was about 100 people in Vienna, intervened. We also put in our interview in the transcription positions and of course Ruan Grupa explaining, answering to the questions posed there, was also a place of inter-reflection. So as Asma is from Vienna and Jelena Petrović is working in Vienna and other positions, they could also think about the Austrian space. So Jelena, before I ask you the question, maybe we can give a short context of Jelena Petrović biography.
Yes, Jelena Petrović is an art researcher, theorist and curator from Belgrade. She's currently working as a senior postdoc researcher on her project, The Politics of Belonging, Art Geographies, at the Institute of Art Theory and Cultural Studies at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna.
Yes, in your talk, in your way of explaining and asking the question, you were doing, Jelena, more than just asking a question. You made actually a very interesting context of your work, a reflection of this accusation. So if we can go back and just make like a trigger for the readers who will take the book in their hands, you were very critical of this critique on Ruan Grupa, and you connected also this with your work because of your experience of organizing many lectures, having a special program on these questions of the global world and the world that is not allowing always that we can talk about different parts of this world and questions many things. So maybe you can give us a view, or also reflect now when you think about the talk and now when you think about your work and these accusations.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Jovita. I would like to thank you so much for inviting me, first of all, to be a part of the book presentation, also for including my short contribution, or rather a comment into the book. I appreciate this for many reasons, but mainly because of silence around this case of Documenta 15 and similar cases of cancellation of Palestinian scholars, artists, all cases which happened recently in the last 2-3 years. And of course, this happened before, but there is some kind of acceleration with this, and with this rise of racism and Islamophobia and so on, other trends in Europe. This silence, why this topic is important to me and why I came to support the first place Ruan Grupa and to express my solidarity with them, because this kind of silence became a modus operandi for dealing with such complex questions when it comes to systematic geopolitical violence, especially in academic and artistic environments. This is what I want to point now. This is for sure a core problem of today's decolonial studies, theories, methodologies, decolonial art, whatever, And because the way how this colonial discourse should look like today in this European context is shaped and controlled by the context which is perceived as dominant one in geopolitical, economic, ethical, and in every other sense, despite the fact who produced it, you know, just maybe people from different contexts will produce, but under control conditions, what can be said or not, and what is appropriate, what is not. What happened exactly with this case of Grupa and this case of cancellation of the lecture of Palestinian scholar Val Al-Qassia with my program Art Geographies, who's supposed to speak about queer in Palestine in May last year, which was at the same time when this all with Grupa happened. So this is, of course, we speak about this Western context, even if it's not anymore denoted like this, you know, just this is really like, it's still dominant, it's still colonial, it's using the colonial studies, it's using this context, and really like how this discourse is manipulated is really a question that we need to face too. And for me, this silence around this critique of Grupa is really like something what's missing in this public space, and especially when it comes to this academic environment or artistic or, you know, just those intellectuals who should speak freely about this, you know, just this is really like, yeah, it's a symptom of something what's happening now with this context of dealing with such difficult question. And one more thing which also related to the context, which I wasn't aware in the sense it was that, or I was aware, I don't know, that is we speak about what, as Hito Steyer said in her text, that is really like it should be aware that this is post-Nazi context dealing with such a question, with such an issue, and we should be aware of this. And I think that is really like a kind of very problematic approach to the thing, because we have a very strong geopolitical violence which is perpetuating by appropriating and hijacking Holocaust. And I think that is really like that should be a place where we should speak about this, you know. So this kind of cancellation in this context and this kind of really kind of silencing such voices is for me something which show that we are living in a very, very dangerous time. Yeah. So I don't know if I answered your question. This is what was why it was important for me to support this publicly.
Yes, not only this is clear, but also just listening to you both and also seeing these two, let's say, parts and thinking about the whole movements that were against the Ruan Grupa, but also the Europe that came out from this discussion was a Europe really of silencing, a Europe of practically not wanting to talk, to discuss, to confront, and what is very paradoxical, indifference, at least at my knowledge, the documentas were always having a big life afterwards. No, you had the big discussions, presentations, people who were part, like curators, they were traveling around, answering to many questions, coming back to many places and so on. This time that was not the case. And this is also a certain symptom of the whole world, but also a symptom of this restriction of big censorship that are going on in this field. So yeah, I think this, what you both expose, it's enough for now regarding that seventh part of the book. Let's leave open, and with your interventions, I think readers can be really triggered to read and to also see that what was our interest in that public talk and in the publication to have as maximum the position of the Ruangrupa, so not the position of the Ruangrupa that is half taken out, but also the possibility for them to reflect what they did as curators, what was actually their position, how they think the process was going on. And so in this moment, let's come to a certain conclusion of the part 7 of the book, and we go to the start. So that means we will now enter part 5 of the book that has a title Insurgent Flows, Trans-Decolonial and Black Marxist Futures. And I will give a short intro what this part that is also connected with what we talk but differently presents and why it's in the book. So about 2 years ago, in the time of the pandemic, in the time of when we were all communicating only through Zoom, with a colleague, Tjaša Kancler, we decided that it will be very interesting to try to think about the changes in a theoretical approach, but specifically to try to think what the trans body is and what it can mean for decolonial theory. Because of this, we also thought can be some kind of insurgent policy. That means that you make a programmatic, theoretical, artistic, activist plan how to relate to the world. And from these ideas with Tjaša Kancler, that is an activist, artist, researcher, and also professor working in Barcelona at the Faculty of Fine Arts, University of Barcelona, we decided also in this idea of changing the format, not always making a book with theoretical text, but actually to try to tackle these questions in another format, to make a film that will be fully done as Zoom. And we embarked and then invited also Jovita Pristovšek to join us for the editing of this film. We embarked to do this experimental, we'll call it experimental documentary film. And from that we selected 8 positions, all very near to us in the terms of thinking, in the terms of acting, also friends like Bogdan, Popa, and Piro, Rexhepi, but also positions like Basha Chenguera, Nat Raha, Ramon Grossfugel, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Aigul Hakimova, Daniela Almesberger. So positions that some are very close, others we follow the work through theory, through activism and so on, to make interviews with these positions. And in the end, we found ourselves with actually almost 8 hours. 8 hours of interviews, because the questions were posed around, as I tried also to explain, we didn't talk about everything, but with every of our speaker in the book or the part in the book, we focus or on a book or on a text or on something that happened as a topic. So we, after this adventure, I will say, of hours and hours of recording and also tying together not only Black Marxism, but also post-socialism, we decided we should make a transcript. As I said, with a colleague, Jovita Pristovšek and Tjaša Kancler, we did this big work, and this is actually the 5th part in the book. So has the title as the film, Insurgent Flows, Trans-Decolonial and Black Marxist Futures. And from that part with us we have at least two fantastic positions. I hope also others are with us. I have to check. I see Piro, and so today let's go into this talk with into this talk. I hope this is working.
Mm-hmm. We have connection issues.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
we are back.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will start with.
Yes, we hear
I
you.
will start with Piro. Piro Rexhepi to talk about this part and also to reflect maybe some lines that we have tackle in these interviews, and as I said, short excerpts from the interviews will be part of the film. This experimental documentary film, the premiere will be very soon. It's almost done. So maybe we present first
Yes,
Piro.
of course.
Yes.
Piro Rexhepi holds a PhD in politics from University of Strathclyde. His research focuses on decoloniality, sexuality, and Islam. His recent work on racism and borders along the Balkan refugee route has been published in a range of media, both inside and outside academia. His last book is titled White Enclosures, Racial Capitalism and Coloniality Along the Balkan Route, published with Duke University Press. So,
Yeah. So Piro, hello.
Hi.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us. The questions also goes very well with some of the points that Asma were exposing initially, also of the interest and questions that you frame from your point of view, and that is actually connected with anti-Muslim racism. This was also our main focus for the interview with Tjaša, because for us this question were and is super important, because anti-Muslim racism is very present in the space of Europe, in the space of the world, I will say, but also it's present very much in the history of socialism, though many say it's not the case, this is not true. In ex-Yugoslavia, everybody was equally treated, we were all equal, and so on. I must say I was in a conference just recently, and this was a question, and somebody absolutely furiously came with this thesis, and I said, come on, let's think and read people that writes about these things, like Piro Rexhepi, and let's stop to sell these stories again and again. So my question will be just precisely this with what we started our interview, and we base this, as I said, also on your analysis, on your text that you continuously publish, and this is first anti-Muslim racism. Can you give us, let's say, like shape how to think about anti-Muslim racism in Europe in general as a start? And the second question will be precisely this question of history of socialism and anti-Muslim racism. So how you see the situation now, Piro?
Thanks. I mean, I think more than or racism directed at Muslim communities, I think I'd start with overall suspicion of the secular project, being that secularism is a product of European modernity, it is an extension of Christianity. And historically in Europe, Muslims, but also other religious minorities, non-Christian religious minorities, non-secular religious minorities, are expected to live in a pseudo-neutral secular world. And so this kind of neutralized secularism is also part and parcel of a colorblind Eurocentrism that refuses to see secularism as an extension of Christianity. And so when Muslims are being asked to coexist in a secular world, they're actually being asked to live an ostensibly Christian public and private life. And so more than racism, I would say, is the problem of secularism, in part because racism and Islamophobia are part and parcel of the far-right project. And as such, far-right and fascist formations don't necessarily hide their fear of Islam, their fear of growing Muslim populations because they think of the world in demographic terms. So that's not necessarily my concern. As I said, my concern is more with the left that imagines a secular world that's supposedly neutral. And actually, I would say that's also far more damning and damaging to Muslim communities than the outright racism from the far right, which can be easily dismissed as it usually gets. And in Eastern Europe, it's even more problematic because this kind of secularism is intertwined with the history of state socialism. And histories of state socialism, like histories of liberal Western European states, also assumed a semi-neutral secularism, but ostensibly a Christian one. And so it's not unusual to attend conferences in Eastern Europe especially, where people feel nostalgic about the socialist past and seek to sort of revive the socialist past as sort of the redeemer of the brighter side of modernity. The darker side of modernity obviously being colonialism, capitalism, and Western modernity. And so from a Muslim standpoint, rather modernity appears in a capitalist, liberal, fascist, socialist form. It's all part and parcel of coloniality, modernity. And it doesn't really make a difference the extent to which their emancipatory project is aligned with secularism, because again, from a Muslim standpoint, secularism is just another watered down form of Christianity. And it's not accidental, I would also add, that in Eastern Europe, there's almost no discussion on the question of secularism. Almost everybody that does work on socialism is completely blind to the works of Talal Assad, Saba Mahmoud, and so this gives birth to all sorts of Eurocentric assumptions about subjectivity, about history, about sexuality, about faith, about desire, and misunderstandings, of course. And so one example, for instance, is how queer and trans embodiments are always expected to rebel against tradition, because from a Christian/secular perspective, only through rebellion to tradition and faith do you acquire agency. But that's because these societies were extremely queerphobic and transphobic and misogynist. And that's not necessarily reflected in other communities. And so what other forms of agency do Muslim people acquire that are not reflected in transgression is, for instance, the question that Muslim queer and feminist scholars have been raising for a while. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but in the broader context, I would say colorblind secularism is the bigger problem than racism. This is not to say that racism is not a problem, but racism is the kind of, or racism directed towards Muslims rather, but racism is the kind of problem where the state and the center left usually ends up engaging or seeking to recruit Muslims by arguing that we need to fight the far right, but leaving completely and totally and utterly unexamined their own deeply rooted Islamophobia under some broader umbrella of we hate all religions, we're atheists, we hate God, which is also a very Christian thing to actually announce. And so for me, that's far more dangerous because it's very seemingly anti-racist, but ostensibly Islamophobic. Because it requires the Muslim subject engaging in solidarity and collaborative networks to buy into whatever modern fiction Christian secular Europeans think is necessary to engage with the Muslim other. And in this sense, the Muslim is continuously the other, as long as such projects of solidarity are always shaped around secular modernity, in whichever form manifests itself. As for the documenta, I mean, it's all new to me because I obviously was not part of it, and it was very interesting to hear. But of course, I'm not surprised. I mean, Austria, Germany were never really denazified, so I mean, from my standpoint, it's, you know, I wouldn't have expected anything less, frankly. And I know that sounds relatively depressing, but I lived in Germany for 2 years, and it was very common to go into feminist collectives in Germany who were socialists, seculars, but then you got to the bar and they had the Israeli flag hanging behind their bar. And so I don't know that it's even, I don't know what to add to that point. But like I said, I mean, this was all new to me. I didn't know the whole Documenta intervention.
Yeah, I must say that this was really great how you turn and also give other insights to the question that also came, some of these things you were already talking inside the interview, and you actually expose this problem, this blind spot that I think when those who will listening to our launch of the book and let's say progressive force, I can suppose they will just jump into air. Because this is honestly, even the question of anti-Muslim racism, just being posited inside the socialist context of a certain history is provoking a big clash, really a big clash, which I was part because I provoked this, and I was just I was very tired of always the same stories that are not leading anywhere, and especially that we can sell outside of the context of former socialism. So I found really valuable, and it's good what you said as reflection to the Documenta, because it's showing, though maybe you are not so familiar, the things are expanding. It's like all of our questions in this book, first you think they are just for specialists in that field, and then you soon understand, going through, that they are just metastasizing, if I can use this horrible word, everywhere. And they are repeating on another format, but the same questions and problems actually are there. So yeah, thank you. And I go immediately to Bogdan Popa, that is also joining us for this part in the book.
Yes, Bogdan Popa is a researcher at the Center for Cultural Innovation and Creativity at Transylvania University of Brasov. He's an intellectual historian specializing in the history of ideas in 19th and 20th century Europe, and he's the author. His last book is titled Decentering Queer Theory, Communist Sexuality in the Flow During and After the Cold War. It was published in 2022. So, Bogdan.
Yeah. So Bogdan, I think all the topics are coming, but not to the same. one after the other, and then taking us to different paths. So when we started the talk with you, and as I repeat in other cases, we had like an agenda. So it was a text, it was a book, it was an activity, something that was important for us to open the question. And in your case, our starting point was the text, Vampiric Necropolitics, a map of Black Studies critique from Karl Marx's Vampire to Get Out Politics of the Undead. It's a long title, and people are now thinking what she's talking about. But to put the things very kind together was that with Tjaša, I remember we discussed, and then with Jovita, a lot about the way how you posit the critique or the analysis of Jordan Peele, Get Out, and especially the way of the formulation of this vampiric necropolitics. And let's start with that. What and how, if you think so now, because you also are very sharp thinker, and many times we start to talk with something, but you say, no, Marina, I change. I'm already out of that. It's not my topic anymore. But let's go with this vampiric necropolitics. Now, how you think about this?
So thank you, Marina, and thank you to Jovita for this conversation. So just to, to contradict you for the sake of the discussion, I would say that I'm like really interested in vampires, and I'm still, I'm still trying to think about the role of vampires today. So in this paper that I wrote with a colleague maybe 6 years ago, we're trying to figure out a change, a sort of a shift from a vampire from the capital. You all remember that the capitalist vampire in the capital appears as one that sucks life, right, out of the labor. So the living labor basically is drained of life by the capitalist. So there are all these issues of exploitation and vampirism when it comes to this Marxist model. But then there was something interesting in what happened to Get Out, right? Probably you all remember the film, and there was a sort of a drive from critical studies people, from cultural studies, to think about this sort of a new form of vampirism that was associated with sucking life out of black or brown bodies, right? So the formulation, this sort of a second vampire that appeared at the time of the Get Out, had to do with the process of extracting something that had to do with the being of the people that were there, right? The blackness and brownness that were associated with particular properties of the people that were involved in this process of exploitation. As you remember with Chris, for instance, from Get Out, the obscene racists that were talking to him, they were trying to extract, they were saying to him, look, you have this really nice, black skin. So because you have this black skin, we want it, and you have these eyes, you can take all this photographs. We want your eyes, right? So those were the obscene racist masters. But then this problem of vampire, if we look through a different lens today, and I think the way I approach it now, I approach it in a different manner, because I don't see it enough as being connected to extracting something that is ontologically related to body, like some particular kind of racial or ethnic identity that is related to bodies. And I'm trying to think about what's happening in terms of this sort of a rise of the obscene masters today. If you think about Trump or if you think about Putin, you see a particular way in which these people assert themselves politically as principled. You know, they have some principles in terms of their defending their country, but at the same time they transgress rules. So to go back to what Piro was saying before, you know, in terms of transgressions, right? The sort of a limit that is placed on transgression. These people are actually confiscated transgression as a political mode of acting. So these new vampires, right? Also, like, I'm really interested today in what's happening with this conversation about whatever on HBO, that there are these shows, The Idol, or The White Lotus, and there is a particular, you know, you see, you know, tourists in Italy, or you see a particular kind of a figure of vampire in Weekend, who is all about sex and using white women, right? So there are all these figures of vampires that are connected to a particular kind of process where people are considering this question of extracting something that is something that has to do with this sort of a position of the subaltern. So to try to think a little bit better about this, my reason today, and again to go back to this conversation about the documenta, I think I'm much more on the line of Hirosh Tylerley here, because I think that we haven't responded enough to these accusations of anti-Semitism. So I would say, like, now I'm thinking about the hysteric, for instance, as a sort of a figure that actually can oppose a particular kind of a form of vampirism. So when you think about Get Out, Chris, right? Chris is he's put in sort of a hysterical position. He's on the chair, and there is this sort of a fake psychotherapist who wants to paralyze Chris. Chris is put in this sort of a sunken place. So that position itself is actually, if you think about it, is how psychoanalysis started, because it's all about hypnotizing the other. You hypnotize the other so the other would do what you want them to do. And to me, this sort of a position of the hysteric, you're put in a position of hysteric to actually say things that are very traumatic to you, right? The death of the character's mother in Get Out. That's sort of a position of a hysteric. If we go back to Freud, right? So Freud, as you know, is a mode of rethinking leftist politics, right? That's a way to maybe to counteract this accusation of anti-Semitism, is to say, well, like, let's think about the power of the hysterics. So the hysterics, and I remember what Marina was telling me in this conversation, right? She told me about, look, just think about what's happening with the gays in that sort of a position, the gaze and the voice, when Chris is losing his voice and gaze when he's hypnotized by the therapist. So there is an entire conversation about that in the book. So building on that, I was trying to think that maybe, like, we haven't thought enough about how to think about sort of how the right wing has taken over the transgression. And we need to think about transgression and forms of exit, forms of challenging capitalism as at the same time, as part of the same move. So for me, again, to go back to this point, we can think about, let's say, Chris, not necessarily right, like an exemplary of a black person whose blackness is extracted from him, and he has to oppose whiteness, but we can think about Chris as a sort of a hysteric that fights racial capitalism, but with particular weapons that are universal, that can be that you can universalize from a particular standpoint. So that's where I'm coming on right now, and I'm glad to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting about this possibility of agency, though in a certain way it's the question of the hysteric, it's one of the central because it's connected with this idea of desire to change the things. It was always seen as an agency. So yeah, let's leave this open. In terms that these things will also appear in the book that we will take in our hands to read, but also in the film that we will watch, and there I think will be in a more surrogate way the positions of 8 speakers that will go one into the other, but not always be one after the other, because also in maybe kind of a clash little bit, and that we like it very much when we were discussing with Tjaša and now editing with Jovita, we put this forward in the film structure. Okay, I think we move to the last part, and this is actually the part number 3, or something that we call bodies in and as political intensities. And we have our fantastic editor of that part, Mika Maruyama, not only taking part now in this book, but already in the previous one that we presented. And maybe we just go first with the bio, and then we enter in the work of what Mika did in the 3rd part of the book.
Yes, Mika Maruyama is a position from Vienna/Tokyo, I would say. She's a writer, curator, and researcher whose theoretical work addresses the intersection of queer and feminist theory and the convergence of media culture and the body politics. So,
yes, Mika, thank you to be with us. And for this part, so not all the part was done in the same way in the book. Some parts was really curated. No, we invited a position, and the position actually then arranged the whole setting. And in this case, you took over, and we were very pleased with what you did, because you decided by yourself to put together a group of really fantastic dancers, choreographers, activists, and provoke them in thinking what you call intra-Asian spatial geography and history realm. And please tell us who were your positions, and what was the focus of the discussion that we published in the book.
Yeah, thank you, Marina and Jovita, for organizing this, and I hope the sound is okay. Sorry, I'm still outside, but I hope this works.
It's good
for you. Okay, good. So thank you for the introduction. I'm Mika, and then right now I'm in Vienna, and I briefly talked about my section called Bodies in and as Political Intensities, that I invited 5 performers, artists, and activists who are working very interdisciplinary field. So they are the performer themselves, but they also work as activists and also visual artists. So like they are using different types of medium, and then also like someone coming from very traditional dance practices, but they kind of having a distance in order to talk about more their socio-political issues. So I also briefly introduced the author. So one is Isa Hoxon. She's based in Philippines, and she's all the time exposes body politics in the service and entire entertainment industry, and especially as a Filipino context, because the Philippines is very known as importing the human labor in the service industry, nursing, and then also entertainment service. So like she started her dance practice as a ballet dancer, but actually she kind of debuted from the pole dancer And then she kind of really talking about how body has been consumed in global context, because like most of the Filipino in industry are working as overseas workers. And then Isa is also the same. So like basically she is getting a lot of funding from the other country and the travel. So like she kind of situated herself as a Philippine overseas workers. And then what's the politics in between, how, you know, what's the body has been consumed, which kind of language has been shaped in the different range of the dance practices. And I also invited from Japan, Yuki Kobayashi. So he started his career actually as a tennis player, but he kind of switched to the more artistic and performative practices. And then he has been using a lot of languages of sports, because this is how he was trained as a tennis player. But he kind of faced a lot of different languages and then reactions of gender for sure, and the sexuality of the time, and then also the how the race also stereotype function in the sports industry. So he has been using a lot of different costume and the sports languages in order to tackle with this topics. And he also funded performance art of platform Still Life in Tokyo in order to talk about the political issues in the performative realm. And from Korea, I invited Saile Unonchon. Saile is also activist, especially like very vocal about LGBTQI issues in South Korea. And especially she is Saile very interested in the desire of anonymous individual connected to some particular events in the history, especially like how queer desire or queer relationship could be possible in some area. So Silent has been researching about a very specific time of performance in South Korea. And then actually this is also like a lot of the same type of the theater is happening into the Asia region, which is all female performer can be on the stage. So like traditionally, there are also the theater that only male can dance, very traditional one. But in especially like in South Korea and then also in Japan and in some areas of in China, so there is only female theater, dance theater, and then especially what Silent was talking was about more resistance, and then this theater was dying out because of the capitalist. Capitalists never take this performance as something important, or they are more kind of the self-organized dance theater. So Silent has been dealing with these issues. And from Taiwan, I invited Yon Chenta. He is more like multimedia artist, but he's very interested to create the live theater. So like he is more kind of dealing with what is performative action in reality, but actually this reality is already kind of enhanced by the multimedia, including social media. So like how we can claim that what is the reality and what is the gender expression in the reality and then social media. And finally, I also invited the Xiaoke. She is a contemporary theater artist. She's coming from very traditional dance, but she is more connected, like in order to talk about what is China in terms of belonging and in terms of how China as a concept can be globalized. So in order to tackle with these issues, she more dealing with the community and inviting like a non-professional performer in the performance to talk about this. So it's quite like challenging interview for me because depending on the context, they have very different specific context. But when we did the interview, it was of course middle of the 2020, which means it's a COVID time, and especially the Asia, we have different quarantine regulations that time. So like, for example, we as Asian, or like someone from coming from Asian countries, we could meet up in Europe, but we couldn't meet each other in the other Asian country because, like, for example, Japan has a 2 weeks quarantine and China has a 4 weeks quarantine, and then in total, if we travel in between the Asia, it takes like 1 month quarantine. So like, I think that's why we couldn't meet, and we also had a different regulations. So that's why, like, I mean, our talk naturally touched on how we have been separated during the COVID time, but actually how this time also allows us to go into more what is specific to like to their topics or their issues. Like, for example, Salem was really talking about, of course, South Korea is one of the more queer country compared to Asia in the discourse, but the reality is not that, you know, it's not the reality in a way. So she was, the Salem was really talking about how trans people really committing suicide, for example, and then if we have this kind of reality, how the performer can do. So Saleh even was suggesting that we could think about the theater without bodies, because basically the people dying, and then if there's no body, how we could imagine about the theater in this period. And then also, like, Isa also suggesting that, because like before the COVID time, the most of the non-European artists has to come to Europe in order to represent their work, or to build the work for the white audience in a way. So like, how we can also detach from this system of the performance as something always compared to the European white ideology. Because like when we are talking about intra-Asia, of course, our modernity starts with the internalized modernization, which of course connected to how the modernity and coloniality is coming together in our mentality. But like, how we can deal with this issue in after the COVID situation.
Good. Thank you. Actually, reading your part and thinking in the process also of our discussions, I really thought that what you are also saying in your intro, that everything leads to a deconstruction of what we call a conventional notions of tradition and authenticity was put upside down. And for the whole book, the thinking was actually something like this. We start from one point, and then, as we could also see in this short presentation, you point one aspect, and the speaker were putting the things upside down, or even not even upside down, but just taking it, we will say once in the past in socialism, the third way. So out of what was the way of expectation. So thank you very much, Mika, and thank you to you all. Now I have actually a question before the closure. If you have any comments in between you, or any kind of thoughts, listening to what was said, what was possible to hear, and so on. If it's something like this, that it's to point out, to ask.
I have a question for Piro, if that's okay. So I agree with you that there is a particular kind of nostalgia when it comes to socialism. So it's basically a past that is frozen and is brought back to today in a sort of imagined way that in many ways it doesn't have to do with the particular tensions, ethnic tensions, chauvinist tensions within the socialist countries themselves. But I wonder if you see anything positive about this sort of a nostalgic move. Is there anything positive that you can see, or is basically a thing that you want us to move away from?
Thank you, Bogdan. I mean, it's all like, for instance, when I go to conferences about the non-alignment and post-Yugoslav conferences, everybody's like, well, nostalgia is a reactionary sentiment and it can only produce reactionary movements, so we can't be nostalgic about Yugoslavia. But then 5 minutes into the conference, everybody's nostalgic about Yugoslavia. And as an Albanian and Muslim, like, I can see why they're nostalgic, because mostly these are people from Zagreb, Ljubljana, or Belgrade, Serbs, Slovenians, or Croats who had a ball during Yugoslavia. And of course, it's like, I feel nostalgic about the Ottoman Empire in that sense, because very likely in those days, my peeps, my ancestors had a ball too. And so I feel their pain in the sense, because they were so privileged in Yugoslavia that they're so blinded by that project and by those privileges that they can't see beyond their nose to see what the experiences of Albanian, Roma, Muslim people were in socialism. And not just in Yugoslavia. I mean, Bulgaria was far more worse. Romania, as you know, as well. So like, I don't know that we can do anything with that project, in part because, I mean, I think possibly assuming that people who invoke it have also enough insight to be able to engage with its shortcomings. But I mean, in the case of Yugoslavia, the way it's done, it's just like this vulgar sort of repetition of a project that fails to see any sort of failure. And I think what that ultimately does is that it pushes people who receive the short end of the stick under socialism further away from it, as opposed to reconsidering it in the first place. And I think what's happening in Kosovo and Bosnia today is an illustration of that, in the sense that these two former Yugoslav provinces remain unresolved and framed in tension, in part because the Yugoslav, post-Yugoslav project never sought to resolve them and continuously sees them as sort of something that should not just be there. Like, it should just either assimilate or die. And in that sense, I think this kind of debates of dialogue and integration that happened in Europe in the 90s, in Eastern Europe, they happened much sooner, in the sense that you didn't have an option. You had to modernize, you had to secularize, you had to assimilate, and in the case of Bulgaria, forcibly so, by getting under the socialist government receiving a Christian name, which I also find, you know, illustrative of that kind of secular socialist secularism. So I don't know. I mean, personally, I think, yes, when it comes to social justice and redistribution, obviously, if I had to choose between the two dark sides of modernity, to use, I mean, because I also think using the term dark side of modernity is probably like very racist in and of itself, but like chances are, yes, I mean, I align with like the idea that there has to be redistributive justice, that capitalism is vampiric, or Draculia, in the sense that it's a blood-sucking animal. But at the same time, it's impossible to create and generate these dialogues because there's, like I said, there's not enough reflection on secularism in former socialist countries. And maybe also because that literature on secularism, hasn't been translated as well. So there's many overlapping issues, but I would say, I mean, I'd say nostalgia in general is, to me, generally problematic. It requires a sort of vision of the past that it's always with rose-colored glasses.
If I can add to this, practically, it's also true that just the facts that we publish this book, that we actually are here and have these dialogues, I think this is very telling, Many were not, having connections in the past, maybe read each other, but not really coming into the possibility to be part of the same book, to read each other reflection. This, I think, is quite an important thing. And as I said, not everything is one-to-one, but what is possible to see in this concrete book and others that we do, it's a certain layer of discussion or certain way or horizon of discussion. And I absolutely agree. Nostalgia is just put in the garbage, and especially the nostalgic. I said what to talk about, what was going on about ex-Yugoslavia. I'll always say just one question: talk about Srebrenica genocide, and then let's go back in history. This is what I will call also a test for me. But if it's no other questions, I thank you very much for this, and I give the words to Jovita to close and put us to an end, and also to thank the fantastic crew
yes,
that is in the back. But Jovita.
So first, I would like to thank you all for your very generous insights, thoughts and strategies. Just as Documenta was actually generous, giving us all those strategies on the plate, strategies of survival. So I think I can return back to Asma and say, if Europe wasn't ready for Documenta, today we heard that we are ready for Europe. So for conclusion, we would like to thank all contributors of the book. We would like to thank Adam Rumans, commissioning editor from Cambridge Scholars Publishing. We would like to thank ZRC SAZU institution as a whole, and especially to Irina Naglic and her crew, wonderful crew, who always takes care that all these events are running very smoothly. And we would also like to thank Academy of Fine Arts Vienna and our audience today here.
It's true.
Yes.
So, thank you, and see you for the next presentation of this book. I hope some of us, we will meet already physically very soon in Graz, and with others in Vienna, in Ljubljana, and also online. Thank you and goodbye.